Hello, we're rolling into another episode of the DRH show. As usual, I talk to interesting people within psychology, mental health, and well-being. Today, I'm joined by an existential therapist, Emmy van Deurzen. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, Dennis.
Okay.
Nice
It's
to be
great to
here.
have you here, Emmy. Let's start off with you telling us your background, your trajectory in life, and how you ended up doing what you're doing.
Oh, that could be a long story. So I was born in the Netherlands, in The Hague, in 1951, not too long after the end of the Second World War. And of course, the war had a huge effect on my country and my family, and it affected my childhood completely. So I grew up with that sense of world tensions, and of course, it was the Cold War as well.
Mhm.
So my own interests were straight ahead with trying to understand why human beings did things like that to each other, and how we could live in a better way, and how we could prevent that kind of thing.
Mhm.
So, I basically pursued everything that I could to learn about that, and started reading about philosophy and psychology and anthropology and sociology from quite early on. And then I left the Netherlands when I was 18 years old because I felt that the country was too small and that I needed to go into the wider world and meet people from different cultures and different countries. And I went to France, where I studied philosophy and I studied clinical psychology, and I became a psychotherapist. And as a psychotherapist, I worked in psychiatric hospitals for a number of years. And then I came to the United Kingdom in 1977 to work with what was then called anti-psychiatry.
Mhm.
And that was a movement to show that people didn't have mental illness, but they needed to be given the opportunity to live their madness, as it were,
Mhm.
without medication and without constriction. So from there on, I began to write about these things myself and have my own ideas about that. And I started publishing books, and I created several colleges over the years. And that's it, really. I
Mhm.
became an existential psychotherapist who was lecturing all around the world and
Mhm.
who's written 17 books to date.
Mm-hmm. It's a lovely background, and I suppose what I should ask you right now is, for those of us who's not familiar, what exactly is existential therapy?
Yeah, well, so existential therapy, of course, means the therapy of existence. So
Mhm.
instead of it just being about the psyche, it is about a person's whole entire existence and everything that matters to them. So we look particularly at the context of a person's life, not just at what is going on inside of them, but also what is going on in their external world and how they relate to other people, how they relate to society, what's happening in their culture, what's happening with the politics, and really also what is their spirituality, what is their view of what the values are that matter in life, and what it is they think they should do with their own existence. So what is their project, what is their purpose in life, and what are the things that are most meaningful to them. And of course, very often we find that actually people have lost a sense of meaning, and they've lost a sense of what is important. And so existential therapists would help you find back the sort of core of what makes you you, and what makes you reattach or reconnect with the things that will give your life intensity, that will allow you to live with more passion, and that will help you find meaning in life altogether.
Mhm. And Emmy, what would you say as the primary strength of existential therapy?
Well, I think the strength is that it is non-cultural specific, so it's not prescriptive, it's not dogmatic. It
Hmm.
doesn't dictate a particular worldview, but rather encourages people to explore their own worldview and to
Hmm.
figure out what the values are that they want to live by, rather than translating their troubles by the standards of a particular worldview.
Hmm.
So it is flexible in that way. And what we have found is that many people around the world have interpreted what you do as an existential therapist in quite different ways, which I think is very good.
Hmm. And of course, it's just like any other form of therapy, it has its own limitations as well. So what would you say its limitations?
Well, its limitations are that if a person is determined, for instance, that they want to be happy, or if a person just wants to get rid of particular symptoms, then existential therapy is probably not the right therapy for them, because
Hmm.
from an existential perspective, we just simply don't believe that happiness is the objective, and we don't believe that symptoms need to be gotten rid of.
Hmm.
Rather, we need to understand what's happening there and kind of find a way to unwrap it and open it up, and to see how every symptom is a way for a person to make sense of something that seems nonsensical, or to build a bridge where a vacuum has been created, and therefore symptoms are highly meaningful. So if a person is searching for a quick intervention that will just rid them of a symptom, then I wouldn't recommend existential therapy.
Hmm. And can you also talk to us about relatedness? Because I've been doing a few readings about existential therapy in preparation for this interview. And if I understand it right, relatedness is one of the predominant concepts within existential therapy. So how does
Mm,
relatedness,
well, that's not
encompass?
exactly what I would say. I know there's some people that would say that, but it's not my particular perspective. But
Mm-hmm.
let's try to make sense of that. So, relatedness is usually understood as being about our relationships with other
Mm-hmm.
people. But what existential therapists are actually interested in is how an individual sort of remains empty until they are connected up to a framework of meaning, to a society, to loved ones, to activities that are important to them, to ideas that matter to them, to things in the physical world. So, at many different levels, we are part of a connective framework, of a kind of fabric of meaning. So, it's not so much about relatedness or relating. It
Mm-hmm.
is very much about recognizing how we are inserted and interconnected with the world. And as I said, that happens in so many ways and at so many levels. And for many people, what goes wrong in their lives is that there is a kind of tear in that fabric of meaning. And when that is torn apart, then they fall into what we call mental illness, but what is actually a kind of lostness, a kind of confusion, a kind of disconnection from the things that will give their lives meaning. So, in that sense, yes, that is a very important aspect of existential therapy.
Hmm. And when you mention about, the breakdown, I suppose, of
Mm.
stability, and I
Yeah.
think that's what existential therapists would say as existential crisis. Am I right?
That's absolutely right. That's exactly what an existential crisis is.
Mm-hmm.
So, an existential crisis is when you suddenly feel that everything that you took for granted and everything that holds your life together is ripped apart. And usually that affects many different layers of your existence. So, it's really confusing. And It is that confusion and that feeling of helplessness in not knowing how it happened or what this means now, and that feeling of suddenly a vacuum being created at the very core of yourself, and you're feeling lost with that, and you're having a sense of great losses happening in your life altogether. That is what creates the existential crisis. So an existential crisis generally happens suddenly, kind of out of the blue, and also it affects several aspects of a person's life. And if it is a really serious existential crisis, it affects all areas of life. So it has a physical impact, it changes your social relationships, it changes your sense of identity, and it also changes the meanings that have been crucial in your life and that have thus far been vital to your sense of balance and your sense of being able to cope.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned earlier that, of course, you can tell it from the name, existential therapy. It's all about existence. So what I'm also interested to find out is, how does this particular form of therapy relate with the idea of death? Because, you know, we keep on talking about the importance of existence, but of course, as beings, we always remind ourselves about our mortality.
Indeed, indeed. So this is the irony of human existence, that no sooner do we come into life or we are already old enough to die. And there is always, from the moment we are born, the sure knowledge that there's only one way to get out of life, and that is through the door of death. What we don't know is when this will happen, but we do know that it will happen. And I think symbolically, this is always with us. So we die many deaths. Every loss we suffer, every person that leaves our life, every time we fail at something, every time we're disappointed, it is as if some of these hopeful connections in our lives get severed, and that feels like the prefiguring of this final moment of death when everything will be pulled apart. So that threat of death is always there in the background of every person's life. But of course, it comes more to the foreground at certain moments. So when we are confronted with illness, or when we are confronted with grave losses, or with an accident, for instance, then obviously that specter of death becomes very real to some people, and they find it very difficult to deal with that. So what existential therapists do is to turn it upside down and to say that the more we are able to be open to the knowledge that we will die, and the more we allow ourselves to think about the end of our lives, but also the end of everything we do, and every relationship, every experience, the more we are aware that things are in time and they are temporal, they have a start and an end and a middle, and they do not last. Nothing lasts forever. And the more we can live with an openness to that idea, the more we will feel the strength of existential courage at the core of ourselves. So it's, as always, quite paradoxical. The more we think about death, and the more we become free to actually love and experience our lives, and the more we try to hide it and not think about it, the more worried we will become, and the more neurotic we will become about trying to cover up these things that remind us that there is something, some shadow hovering over our lives that we haven't allowed to face in our lives. So this is very much the key to how we work. Rather than running away from difficulties, we face them. And rather than fearing things, we come to realize that every time we open up to a challenge, we become a little bit stronger, and life becomes a little bit more colorful and a little bit easier as well.
Mm-hmm. Emmy, could you also talk us more about what it exactly is existential coaching, and how, I suppose, how can we benefit from existential coaching?
Yes, so existential coaching is a more hands-on approach than existential therapy
Mm-hmm.
is. So it sometimes can be quite systematic. So we have particular instruments we might use to be able to get a sense of where the person is at on the path of life and which areas of life are problematic for them, and then really work with them to help them get more of a sense of balance in that. And not just a sense of balance, but rediscovering one's own capacity for being a balancing mechanism, because this is something that our consciousness is capable of. We are capable of figuring out how we can make things right for ourselves. We are problem solvers. We are capable of understanding things. We're capable of creativity and of finding really very unexpected new solutions to things. So existential coaches focus very much on these kinds of concrete problems that people might bring about their lives, and help people reconnect with their own creativity and their own capacity for figuring out how life works, what they're doing wrong, and how they might find a way around these obstacles and find a new target, a new project, a new meaningful pathway forward through the difficulties.
Mm-hmm.
So that is what coaches will focus on, whereas existential therapists will tend to be much more open-ended about it and allow a person to be much more free in their explorations of everything under the sun and everything that is problematic to them at any one point.
Mm-hmm. And of course, I mean, you are an existential therapist. As an existential therapist, who usually do you work with? And could you give us like a quick snapshot of your usual approach?
Right, so I work with all sorts of people, and I have worked with all sorts of people over my long career.
Mm-hmm.
So I've worked since 1972, so that is now 48 years. And during that time, I have worked with people with diagnoses of psychosis, autism. I have worked with people who have been through the Holocaust, who have been in wars, who have been refugees. But I've also worked with very ordinary people who live fairly humdrum lives and who have much smaller problems. And I have discovered that actually most human problems are very similar, and we all have a lot in common, and that our capacity for suffering stretches to the size of the problem, so that when we have huge problems, it feels just as difficult as when we have tiny problems that fills our lives too. And I've worked with organizations and with groups and with institutions. I have worked with families. I have worked a lot with couples. And well, I've done existential coaching quite a bit too.
Mm-hmm.
You name it, you know, I've never been too selective. I've always been open to experiment and experience new challenges and new situations with people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's it really shows how like malleable and applicable existential therapy is. Now,
Definitely.
what I would like to find out is, because there's also another form of therapy, CBT, and I just want to hear your thoughts. How does it contrast, or does it complement with existential therapy?
I like that word.
Mm-hmm.
I think it is a good way to complement the work. I have had doctoral students who have worked on this. One particular one, Anders Sørensen in Denmark, did his doctoral research on comparing and contrasting CBT and existential therapy. And what he found was that, of course, CBT is much more prescriptive, whereas existential therapy is much more open. And that if you know how to do both things and you can adjust to what is more needed for a particular client at any point, that can work quite well together, because both share one particular thing in the psychotherapy world, which is that they both believe that therapy has an educational side to it, that it isn't about pathology, but it is about teaching people, enabling people to understand better what has gone wrong, so that they can change something in the way they live and in the way they do things. Now, CBT will do that in a much more concrete and a more cognitive way, and existential therapy will do that in a more philosophical way and in a more emotionally engaged way, perhaps. But you know how it is, different people like different things, and so sometimes clients like even an existential therapist to work more with that cognitive side of things and be slightly more guided in their interventions. And sometimes CBT therapists find clients who really do want to understand things more and to have a much more open conversation about things. So they can indeed, as you said, complement each other quite well.
Now, Emmy, you mentioned earlier that you've been working within this field for nearly 50 years. So what's the most important thing that you want the public to realize about your work?
Oh, about my work, I'm not sure. What I would like the public to realize about themselves more is that they underestimate themselves, and many people get stagnating and stuck in patterns of life that make them very unhappy and quite dysfunctional. And many people struggle with that for decades sometimes, instead of realizing that it is actually possible to liberate yourself and to open your heart and your mind and your life up to a completely new way of doing things, thinking about things, relating to the world, relating to other people. And that it is so very, very important that people are aware of this and are made aware of how they can do that, because it seems to me so wasteful that we have figured all this out and that there are relatively so few people who are able to take advantage of that. So that is the thing that is closest to my heart at the moment. And I think because of that, I like to do these kinds of things, because I'm hoping that this will get the ideas out there to a wider public, rather than just keeping it quite sort of secret almost within the community of counselors and psychotherapists. I think it is very important to popularize these ideas, and that the world really needs that, especially existential ideas, because, you know, existential therapists are willing to see the connection between their mental health and politics, or mental health and what is happening in their family. Or it allows people to get out of the prisons they have put themselves in. And so I hope many more people discover about that.
And I'm also very grateful that you're giving me a chance to interview you, because I also believe that, you know, people such as yourself who have a particular theory, who have a particular therapy, you know, it's important that you spread out your message, especially for people who's trying to look for what's the best therapy that they need, or whatever crisis they encounter. And I also like to touch upon what you mentioned about empowerment. And I guess that's one of the bedrock of psychotherapy, whether it's psychodynamic, whether it's CBT or existential therapy. It's all about empowerment. Like you mentioned earlier, on the earlier stages of your work, there was a bit of an anti-psychiatry movement. So I suppose what I would like to find out is that why does it why is it important that we don't just pathologize or medicalize mental health issues?
Well, it's extremely important because we actually have enormous amounts of evidence to show that many of the problems people struggle with have come out of the experiences that they have had. And quite often those are related to traumatic events that come out of either poverty or catastrophes that have happened to their families, or that have come out because of environmental disasters like tsunamis or pandemics, or things like that can happen to anybody out of the blue. And that when those things happen to people, for a certain number of people, that will impact them to such an extent that they become imprisoned in these emotional and mental health problems. So rather than thinking that it is some kind of illness that has infiltrated your brain or that comes from because you're born that way, it's very important to understand that these things are circumstantial and that they are about your situation and your predicament, and that therefore it is possible to release yourself from it too. Mm-hmm. And that culpabilizing yourself or telling yourself off about it is not going to help. It's just going to make it worse. And understanding this is not your fault and it is possible to get out of it is the first step to finding a new way forward.
Mm-hmm. And in your work as an existential therapist, is there a particular individual or a particular piece of literature which has the greatest influence to your approach?
Well, that's got to be philosophy, because at the end of the day, it's the philosophers still now who I think throw most light on human existence. And sometimes they're also novelists, of course. So I should certainly credit the philosophers that influenced me most to start with. And those were Socrates and Plato, because they're thinking about the world in that sort of broad-minded way, I think was very influential on me and continues to be of importance to me. But then there were also people like Spinoza, who came up with his alternative theory of ethics and the emotions. And then, of course, some of the existential philosophers like Husserl and Heidegger and Sartre and Merleau-Ponty and Simone de Beauvoir. All these people have been pioneers of thinking anew about what the human condition is about, and therefore they led the way to explore those things in a kind of revolutionary way without feeling stuck by the old systems of values and the old belief systems. So I think I'm still very grateful to some of those authors for having liberated my mind and having educated me to dare to strike out and read and read and read and live and live and live and think and think and think and reflect and understand things better and better. So we all help each other, you know?
And for those because a lot of the people who's going to watch this video are students, and they would be probably watching this because they're interested to become an existential therapist. So can you recommend to us a book if we are going to pursue a career as an existential therapist?
Right. Okay. Well, the first books I read about existential therapy were the books by R.D. Laing. So that's the guy I came to the United Kingdom to work with. And the book that I would recommend the most is The Divided Self. And then if you're interested in my particular approach, I would recommend you take a look at my book Paradox and Passion, which was published by Wiley, and that you have a look at my book published by Sage, which is called Psychotherapy and the Quest for Happiness, which is precisely not about happiness, but about why just looking for happiness is the wrong way to go about it, and it is better to take it in the other direction.
Mhm.
So it's paradoxical, right? So paradox and passion, and psychotherapy in the quest for happiness. And if you're interested more in the theory, there's a little book called Existential Therapy that I co-authored with Claire Arnold Baker, you might find helpful. And if you're really, really serious about it, then read my book Everyday Mysteries, or read the more recent Wiley World Handbook for Existential Therapy, which had 6 editors and where we have people from all around the world showing the different ways of existential therapy in different cultures, and which also speaks about the past of existential therapy and all the influential philosophers, the influential therapists, and where we're going for the future. So that's the most complete of the books.
Mhm. Thank you for sharing to us those books. What I'll do is I'll put that on the description box. So for anyone who wants to get a copy of that book, they could easily find it. Thank you, Emmy.
Brilliant.
And of course, you've been nearly working as an existential therapist for nearly 50 years. And I'm quite sure that you've come across with a number of misconceptions about existential therapy. So I suppose this is the best time to address those misconceptions.
Well, the most frequent misconception is that people confuse existential for meaning existentialist.
Mm-hmm.
So existentialism is just one kind of existential philosophy, which was basically popular in the 40s and 50s in France and on the continent. But existential philosophers have existed throughout history and really throughout the world. So I would argue that existential thinkers can be found in some religious areas too. So some Taoist literature is a search for existential truth. Some Buddhism is a search for existential truth. Some Hinduism is a search for existential truth. Some of Christianity is existential, and there are indeed very Christian existential authors like Paul Tillich, for instance, or Gabriel Marcel. So existential thinking goes across cultures, across religions, and across history. It is the search for wisdom about how a person can better live their life. So that really annoys me when people think it's just about existentialism. It's much, much broader than that. And the second thing is the confusion with humanism as well.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a form of existential therapy, which is called existential humanist therapy, which concentrates more on some of these humanist ideas. For instance, they will work particularly with the here and now, when most existential therapists don't work with the here and now. They work with the here and now. They work with the past, the immediate past, the remote past. They work with the future. They work with temporality. They work with what is beyond death, before death. They work with eternity. They work with time in all different aspects. So not just in the here and now. Mm-hmm. So those are two of the things that I find over and over again that people misunderstand about existential therapy. So thank you for letting me talk about that.
I'm actually also guilty. I have to confess, I'm also guilty about those misconceptions. In particular, I also conflict the tenets of existentialism with humanist theory. But thank you for addressing that.
It's quite different because, so for instance, Carl Rogers, you know, his belief is that the inner goodness of the person will just grow and grow if you give them the right conditions to grow in. Whereas existential theorists and existential practitioners will usually accept that what actually happens in human beings is that there is a constant struggle between light and dark, between life and death, between hope and despair, between good and evil, between love and hate. You know, you can't get away from that struggle. That is what human existence, well, what probably all life is about a constant interaction of forces that are in some kind of exchange with each other. And if we're going to find out how to live better lives, we have to take that tension into account. We can't remove that from the world. That will always be there, but we can work with it. And we can stop believing that one side is good and the other side is bad, because it doesn't work like that. What is actually good is the differential, because, you know, this is how you create energy. When you look at a battery, the energy flows between a positive pole and a negative pole. And this is how life works. You have to have that kind of tension, and you have that kind of paradox and conflict and dilemma to actually move forward in the world.
Mm-hmm. And Emmy, I just want to ask you a different question. What's your distressing outlet? What other interests do you have other than psychotherapy?
Oh, I got too many. I can't get around to doing everything. So obviously I love to read books just for pleasure. Mm-hmm. And I have been painting in oils since I was 15 years old. And I do quite a lot of landscape painting. And I really, really enjoy that and find myself getting really absorbed by that. I like to go on the bicycle. And every week I go for long hikes in nature, at least once, but usually several times. And I have recently, just in the last 6 months, started to teach myself to play the piano. Mm-hmm. And that's been a big challenge, but it's been very pleasurable too, to finally acquire this new skill that I always wanted. I play the guitar, and I've played the guitar since I was 15, and I write songs, and you can listen to those on YouTube, mm-hmm. where you can also find other videos that I do regularly. But obviously singing and writing songs and music are very important things to me, as well as painting and nature.
Mm-hmm. And finally, Emmy, what's in the pipeline? Do you have any upcoming talks or any upcoming webinars?
Oh, yes. Well, lots of things coming up always. So in the next few weeks, I'll be doing a keynote for the Moscow conference, the 6th Congress for Psychotherapy. And I will be doing a keynote for the Melbourne conference on grief. Mm-hmm. And I'll be doing workshops online for the for existential supervision in Australia as well. I should have gone to Australia, but obviously that's not happening now. And, oh, well, there's so many things. I can only think about 3 weeks ahead like that. Mm-hmm. Constant talks and constant things. And in terms of my writing, I am just finishing my next book, mm-hmm. which is called Rising from Existential Crisis, mm-hmm. which is all about how we can use the experience of crisis to actually thrive, mm-hmm. rather than just survive. Mm-hmm. And then after that, I will be doing a book on structural existential analysis, which is a form of existential research that I have worked with over the years.
Mm-hmm. You're really very busy. And I suppose that, you know, this field, existential therapy, becomes more even relevant, especially in light of the coronavirus and the pandemic, because obviously those situations, you know, it allows us to reflect about our own existence and about our own mortality. So I suppose the best thing to do is just put the link to your website. I understand that all of those will be on your website, the events, and also the books that you've authored.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so it's emmyvandeurzen.com, but you might also want to go to my psychotherapy school, mm-hmm. which is nspc.org.uk, nspc.org.uk for a new school of psychotherapy and counseling, or existentialacademy.com.
Existentialacademy.com.
Existentialacademy.com. Yeah.
Okay, I'll definitely put those lists on the video description box. Well, it's been an insightful conversation with you, Emmy, but unfortunately our time is up. Thank you for sharing with us your time and of course your expertise. I look forward to hearing more about your work.
Thank you, Dennis. Bye-bye.